Darren immediately tries to catch Octa, but Steve gets busy killing him. Then Octa runs into a hall room. All the students get scared seeing Octa. He then tried to get out through the window. Steve then tries to kill him, but Octa gets inside his t-shirt and bites him on the cheek. As a result, Steve fainted there. Next, Darren went to the circus to meet with Ladern, and after telling him all the events, requests to save Steve's life. But Ladern does not agree with his words. After Darren requests him repeatedly, he agrees on one condition: that Darren must be his vampire assistant. It means he has to leave his family, friends, and society. Darren wants to save Steve somehow, so he agrees to Ladern's terms. Ladern then uses his finger to mix vampire's blood into Darren's body. As a result, Darren has the power of half vampire. Ladern then puts Darren on his back and takes him to the hospital within 3 seconds, and injects a vampire antidote into Steve's body. As a result, Steve recovered. On the other hand, as Darren turns into a half vampire, he starts eating raw meat. And one day he wanted to drink his sister's blood, but he somehow controls himself. Darren suffers greatly as a result of this incident. Just then he saw Ladern. Actually, Ladern comes to warn Darren. He says you have to leave your family from now on, because when you are with your family, danger can happen anytime. But Darren doesn't want to do that. Suddenly, he recalled the disturbing incident, where he had tried to drink his sister's blood. That's why he agrees to leave his family. Darren was afraid that his parents would be very upset if he suddenly left his family, so they make a plan. And Ladern forces Darren to drink a potion and throw him off the roof. He kills him in such a way that everyone realizes that Darren died naturally. After that, we see the first scene of the movie. On the day of Darren's funeral, he played games inside the coffin. Later that night, Ladern goes to the gravesite and brings Darren out of the coffin. Just then Merlot, the Vampan's leader, arrives and starts attacking them. But Ladern crashes him in a car and runs away with Darren. Meanwhile, Steve becomes very aggressive. Darren was actually Steve's only friend, and since he died, Steve has been all alone. So one day he decided to commit suicide. Whenever Steve jumps from the roof, Mr. Tiny comes there and stopped him from committing suicide. Here Mr. Tiny tells him, "I know your life and dream of becoming a vampire very well. That's why I want to give you a chance to become a vampire." Then Mr. Tiny tells him everything about Darren. That Darren is alive and has now turned into a vampire. Also, Mr. Tiny wants him to be enmity with Darren, and says, "You had a dream to become a vampire, but Darren took away your dream." After learning all this, Steve is furious about Darren, and accepts all terms of Mr. Tiny. On the other hand, Darren slowly befriends the other members of the circus, and he began to train to increase his power. But one day he misses his family and friends a lot, and he tries to call Steve on his phone. Just then Ladern comes in and snatches Darren's phone and breaks it, because she doesn't want anyone to know about Darren. In the meantime, Mr. Tiny comes there. Mr. Tiny is a vampanzi, which means he is the leader of vampires. Here we learn that Darren has an innate superpower. That's why Mr. Tiny wants to keep him with himself. When he talks about taking Darren with him, Ladern tells him to lie, saying Darren can't go with you right now. After Mr. Tiny leaves, Ladern tells Darren, "You will never go out of the circus, because Vampanzi can kidnap you anytime." Ladern then gives Darren a variety of training so that he can protect himself. Merlot, on the other hand, transforms Steve into a vampire. As a result, Steve gets a lot of power and changes into a demon. Steve first killed his school teacher. Meanwhile, Darren gets very hungry. So Ladern took him to a nearby farmhouse, and knocks a man unconscious and asks him to suck his blood. But Darren was a kind man, so he couldn't do it. Ladern warns him that he will die if he does not drink the blood. Then the Vampanzi team suddenly came there and attacked them, resulting in a fierce fight between the two teams, where some even lost their lives. Actually, the Vampanzis have come to find Darren. Just then a Vampanzi finds Darren. He was hiding in a room with Rebecca. Here is the fight between Darren and the Vampanzi. That's when Ladern comes in and saves Darren. Then all the Vampanzi ran away. After some time they come to know that Marlog has kidnapped Rebecca. The next morning Darren goes out alone to find her, because he thought it was all happening to him. Meanwhile, Mr. Tiny kidnaps his family to catch Darren. On the other hand, Darren goes home to visit his family, but his house was completely empty. Just then he saw a poster on the table. It read that Tiny was waiting for him at the circus. Meanwhile, Ladern decides to fight the Vampanzis and prepares all his weapons. By then, Darren reaches the circus, where he finds Rebecca and her family hanging from ropes. Here he sees Steve with the Vampanzi and understands he has also turned into a vampire. Just then Steve attacks Darren, and the fight started between them. Meanwhile, Ladern arrives and fights with Marloag. On the other hand, Darren is weakened by not drinking blood. Just then Rebecca runs away from there and comes to him, and asks to drink his blood so that Darren becomes strong again. But he doesn't want to drink Rebecca's blood. Rebecca tries to convince him repeatedly, then Darren drinks his blood. Ladern, on the other hand, is also heavily injured, but he does not give up in any way, and kills Merlot while fighting. Darren meanwhile regains his strength and begins to fight Steve. Just then Mr. Tiny comes in and stops their fight. He then uses his superpowers to revive Merlot and transform him into a creature. Then Mr. Tiny asks them both to come with him, where Darren doesn't want to go with him. But Steve chooses the devil's path and goes with Mr. Tiny. After they leave, Layton hypnotizes Darren's family and erases the events from their brains. As a result, they forget all those incidents. In the last scene of the movie, we see Darren back at the circus. All the members of the circus welcome him. And this is where the story of the movie ends.